Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on the place you are around the world. Time flies a lot, sorry. And you can see that I am in San Francisco, the US West Coast, because I came here just to talk with Oleg Ivanov. He's the assistant director of the San Francisco office of the American Jewish Committee. And why I came here? Because he's a really interesting person. He earned his PhD at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he research focused on the creation of Soviet Antizionism and dissemination, which is very, very important. And also, we will touch base on how he's joining the Hindu American Foundation in a rally about something that happened in India uh, just a month ago. So let's say welcome. And I need to also remember my audience that a coffee with Cabana, in Spanish, a café with Cabana, is sponsored by the German Jewish Museum in Santiago, Chile. And we are grateful to have you here in the show and welcome to a coffee with Cabana. Hello, Oleg.
Hello, Roberto. Mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto. Well, I know that you were not born in the U.S., so you came to the U.S. and it maybe because of your name, it might look like you came from Europe.
Hmm.
So if we can start with this, is your background and where you were born, that will be really fantastic.
Sure, sounds good. First off, thank you so much for having me. Very grateful for the honor to speak with you and your audience today about these important issues for the Jewish community. Like you said, I was not born here. I was born in Ukraine when it was part of the Soviet Union in the great city of Odessa, which a little bit over 100 years ago was actually the third largest Jewish city in the world. So it's a city with a very long and proud Jewish heritage and history, and I'm proud to be a part of it. So I was born there in the 80s, like I said, when it was still part of the USSR. My family emigrated here to America, to San Francisco, when it was still the Soviet Union. This was during the Cold War. And I grew up here in San Francisco. My family on both sides has been in Ukraine for hundreds of years. I still have family there, many close friends as well. A lot of my work has been focused on the post-Soviet Jewish community. So this work has involved advocacy work, both for the Jewish community there, but also for the Ukrainian government, supporting for it, advocating for more material and humanitarian aid for Ukrainians and refugees and immigrants, and also for the government in its fight against the Russian invaders. And I've also had the chance with organizations like the Joint Distribution Committee or JDC to work with communities on the ground, impoverished Jewish communities, whether this is the elderly or young people. So I've spent a lot of time there. I know that community well, all over the post-Soviet world. Also, part of my PhD work was in St. Petersburg in Russia. So I've also spent some time there, and I know the many members of the Jewish community there as well. And unfortunately, this is a very tragic conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that has divided that community and has affected the Jewish community on both sides of the border. So that's some of my background for Eastern Europe. I grew up here in San Francisco, this wonderful city where you are
Yes.
joining me today on the West Coast here in the US, in California. Grew up here, went to high school, left to go to college. As you said, I went to the University of California in Los Angeles for my undergraduate and PhD. Spent many years in New York and on the East Coast working in the Jewish advocacy world. And now I'm proud to be back here in San Francisco, where I grew up, where my family is, to work for the community here and to make San Francisco and Northern California a better and safer and more inclusive community for its Jews and for everyone else here.
Oh, okay. That's well. This is a good beginning, yeah. And so let's go deep into the details of this program, which will be first of all is if you can tell us about the what was when Russia was not Russia, when it was USSR, and how the Jewish community was, taking care about this dissemination and discrimination and everything.
Sure. Well, it's a long and complicated story, and we're not going to be able to cover all of it. The Soviet Union lasted for about 70 years. So we'll go into some of the general broad outlines and some of the details as well. But, it is important to understand some of the history. So, of course, during the Russian Empire, at a certain point, the Russian Empire expanded west, and it conquered areas of what are now Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Latvia, Estonia. And these areas had historically been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, had been independent at some points, but they had large Jewish communities. So until the Russian Empire conquered these territories, the Russian Empire did not have really very sizable Jewish communities. They had some Jews here and there, but really no big official community to speak of. And of course, this changed entirely, especially when they conquered what is now Ukraine and Poland. And all of a sudden, they had millions of Jews in their borders. So this country had to figure out what to do with this Jewish community. Many ethnic communities face different forms of discrimination in the Russian Empire, but the Jewish community, I think you could safely say, really faced more discrimination than any others. They were placed in what was called the Pale of Settlement, and this basically was a geographic area, again, compromising primarily what is now Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, and they were really not allowed to leave that area within the larger Russian Empire. They needed special permits to travel outside of the area, special permits to settle in population centers like Moscow or St. Petersburg. And they faced other forms of discrimination where Jewish children were drafted into the army. They were often forced to give up their religion. They were not allowed to keep kosher. And of course, they faced many pogroms, in the Jewish community, particularly in what is now Ukraine and Moldova. And many of these pogroms, which were attacks on the Jewish community, were really supported by the Russian government in one way or another. So this is the background for the Russian Revolution of 1917. So when this revolution happened, many Jews in the area really thought this was going to be an improvement. And in fact, you did have many, though by no means all Jews, that really, in one way or another, were at least hopeful that the Russian Revolution would bring equality to the Jewish community there. And it was a very bloody revolution, and Jews got caught up in it. During the revolution itself, which of course coincided with World War I, you had about 30,000 Jews that were murdered, again, primarily in what is now Ukraine, as a result of the war. And while the majority of these atrocities were carried out by the White Army, this was the army that was supporting the Russian Empire and the Tsar, there were also atrocities carried out by the Red Army or the Communist Army. So even already in this period, you do see that, again, you have anti-Semitic targeting from both what we would now call the far left and the far right of the political spectrum. But that being said, once the revolution ended, and once the USSR was born, there were laws passed that guaranteed equality for Jewish citizens, like all other citizens, where there was no longer discrimination based on their religious or ethnic identity. Now, these laws were these were de facto laws, meaning that yes, this was the law. And yes, even in these early decades of the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s, you had prosecutions for anti-Semitism. I mean, there were cases in the Soviet courts where you had people that were prosecuted and found guilty and sentenced for acts of anti-Semitism. That being said, it's also worth knowing that from the very beginning, it was a very ambivalent experience for the Jewish community. So right away in the 20s and 30s, as part of its larger anti-religious campaigns, the Soviet government did suppress rabbis. They closed yeshivas. They closed schools of Jewish learning. At a certain point, it basically became illegal to teach Hebrew outside of a university setting. Again, some synagogues were allowed to remain open, but this was really to as a showpiece to really show that, you know, when visitors came from the outside world, to show, no, of course there was still thriving Jewish life, synagogues were still open, but again, this was really for show, while really Jewish religious life, Jewish traditions were being suppressed in the Soviet Union. But again, it was ambivalent because at the same time, Jews as citizens were given equal rights for the first time in the territory. So this is some of the background for what then really changed in the 1930s. And, you know, we could really see this change happen after the death of Lenin, who was the leader of the Communist Party as well as the Soviet government. And after he died, there was really a power struggle between Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. And Leon Trotsky was, of course, a Jew from what is now Ukraine. And again, very ambivalent Jewish identity. On the one hand, he didn't necessarily deny his Jewish identity, but he also very much made it clear that he was not someone who was there to fight for the Jewish community, to be an activist for the Jewish community. He saw himself as a Bolshevik and as a communist. And unfortunately, what happened for him and what happens to many Jews all over the world is that, again, he really was forced to relinquish his Jewish community to be accepted as a Bolshevik, a Soviet. This also coincided with very similar event in more broad political terms, where before the revolution, there were many socialist parties, not just the Bolshevik Party. And one of them was the Jewish Bund or Bund. And this was essentially a Jewish socialist party. Now, after the Soviet Union was created, all other socialist and communist parties were outlawed except the Bolshevik Party. And this included the Jewish Bund. So again, Jews were forced to really give up their Jewish identity to be able to be accepted in this larger communist collective. And in fact, it's very shameful because there was actually a committee within the Bolshevik Party, within the Soviet government, called the Yevsektia, Yevreiskaya Sektia. This means the Jewish section. And these were Jewish communists whose job it was to go around, close synagogues, close yeshivas, to target rabbis. And it was really, again, part of this atheist, anti-religious campaign. But unfortunately, you had these Jewish communists whose job it was to suppress other Jews in their practice of the Jewish religion and Jewish traditions. So Trotsky really fits into this larger narrative pattern. And just as with Trotsky and as with members of this Jewish section, when eventually Stalin came to power, when he was able to defeat Trotsky for essentially supreme power in the Soviet Union, in the 1930s and 40s, when you had many purges in the Soviet government, led by the Stalinist government, many of these people, members of the Jewish section, were themselves then persecuted. So these people who had worked for the Soviet government to suppress their Jewish co-religionists were themselves now suppressed. They were tried, put into prisons. Many of them were shot by the NKVD, which later became the KGB, the Jewish security service. The Soviet security services. Yes, exactly. And so this is really when we could see a turn. Is in the 1930s we see this turn when there is this move against even these committed Jewish Bolsheviks. And again, this really started when Stalin defeated Trotsky. And after this, in Stalin's mind, there was a real paranoia about the Jews, because for him, he started to connect Trotsky with Soviet Jews more broadly, as not only his own personal enemies, but as enemies of the Bolshevik Party. Now, this doesn't really come to fruition until later in the 1930s and 1940s. As many people still don't know today, the Soviet Union actually made a pact with Nazi Germany and the Nazi Party called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This was before the start of World War II. And what this pact did was it was a non-aggression pact between the Soviet government and the Nazi Party of Germany. And what this agreed to was that it basically divided up Eastern Europe between Soviet spheres of influence and Nazi spheres of influence. So the Nazis were able to move in from the west, occupying about half of Poland, and the Soviets moved in from the east, occupying what are now the Baltic countries and the other half of Poland. So what's interesting is here in the West, we think of the war, World War II, starting in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. But still to this day in Russia, it's not called World War II. It's called the Great Patriotic War. And
Yes.
it's really commemorated. The idea is that it starts in 1941, because 1941 is when the Nazis broke this pact with the Soviet Union and invaded the USSR. But again, this conveniently skips the fact that the Soviets were allies with the Nazis and that they invaded Poland along with the Nazis at the same time that World War II was starting for the rest of the world. So this is a background for
Wow.
this. So essentially, when you have this pact, you have Nazi high officials coming to Moscow, meeting with high Soviet officials. They're toasting to the friendship of these countries, friendship between the Bolshevik Party and the Nazi Party. And as this is happening, Jewish figures obviously start to get removed from positions of power within the Soviet government, within the nomenklatura, which is the bureaucratic class, within just visible positions in Soviet society. So this is really what we can think of as the real beginning of this official Soviet anti-Semitic campaign. Up to this point, Jews had been repressed as part of larger campaigns within the USSR, but they hadn't really been targeted as Jews per se. This is really the first time, to appease their new Nazi partners, that the Soviet government started to target Jews specifically. And to some extent, this receded when the Nazi Party invaded the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And of course, you had many great Jewish heroes in the Red Army, in frontline reporters in the Soviet press, including Vasily Grossman, who was one of the first people to write about the liberation of the concentration camps. He was a very famous Soviet Jewish writer. His novel Life and Fate is probably the single most important Soviet novel about World War II and about the Soviet Jewish experience. He was embedded with the Red Army when they eventually pushed back the Nazi invaders and headed west. And he was there when they were among the first people to liberate the concentration camps, and was among the first people to write about it. So of course, you did have many important, very visible Jewish leaders, military commanders, again, writers, members of the intelligentsia during World War II, who did have a visible impact in the Soviet Union. An important part of this story is the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. This was one of many committees that was made by the Soviet government to basically drum up support for the Soviet Union's fight against the Nazi invaders during World War II. So there were several of these anti-fascist committees. One was this Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And what their job was, they went to Western countries. And again, this is especially in America, which again didn't join the war effort until 1941. And they really wanted to get material support, both from the Jewish communities there, but also from the larger Western public. And so this was an officially sanctioned mission from the Soviet government that supported this. There were, in fact, KGB agents embedded in this mission that were taking down everything that members of this group were doing, everything they were saying, who they were meeting with. And this is going to be an important story, part of the story later on. So what happens is, on the one hand, during World War II, you do have this visible Soviet Jewish presence. On the other hand, this process that started with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact starts to continue bit by bit. You do see very slowly Jews start to be taken out of positions of influence in academia, in culture, in the government, in the military. And so when the Soviets win World War II, along with the other Allied countries,
yes,
there's this very interesting point where it's sort of this transition stage. So obviously, several million Jews had died in the Soviet Union on Soviet land, in what are called, it's essentially in these killing fields, right? So this is called the Holocaust by bullet. You, of course, had millions of Jews die in the concentration camps. And then you had Jews in Eastern Europe on what was Soviet territory that were rounded up and that were murdered en masse by the SS and by other elements of the German army. Babi Yar outside of Kiev is one of the most famous sites where you had this mass killing. But that's just to name one. Really, in just about any Soviet city or village where there was a Jewish population that the Nazis occupied, you had these kind of mass killings that took place. So, so what happens after the war is very interesting. Initially, there seems to be support for telling this Jewish story, telling the story of the Holocaust. Vasily Grossman, who I mentioned earlier, and other Soviet Jewish writers were actually invited to give testimony accounts of the Jewish experience during World War II, including experiences of the Holocaust, write firsthand accounts of the concentration camps, of people who had survived these mass executions. And so this is called the Black Book. And initially, it was going to be printed by a big Soviet publishing house. All the proofs were already were approved for it. And right around 1947 is really when you start to see this turn. So you start to see there was a very famous Yiddish theater in Moscow that was closed down. And this Yiddish theater was run by one of the heads of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And he is eventually murdered right around this time by the Soviet secret police. Now, the fact that he was murdered by the Soviet secret police did not really come out until many years later. But this was something that many people understood already at this time in the Soviet world, especially among the Jewish community through word of mouth. And so really this signaled this crackdown on Jewish life in the USSR. So this was really the beginning of something called the Night of the Murdered Poets. And it was really around this time that these very famous, world famous Soviet Jewish writers, many of whom wrote in Yiddish, but not exclusively, were rounded up by the Soviet government, put into prisons and murdered, executed in these prisons. And so this is really where you see that the Soviet government is now turning against its Jewish community, against this thriving Yiddish culture. And of course, what's sad is that you, of course, had this Yiddish culture that was destroyed in the Holocaust. And really what was left of it was in this Soviet world. And then after the Nazis destroyed it, the Soviets basically finished it off in the USSR. And part of this was also disbanding the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And so there was this campaign. And again, this goes back to this sort of interesting point that so many Jews were murdered on Soviet land, right? So the Soviet Union couldn't really come out and say, we're going to round up all of our Jewish writers. We're going to kick Jews out of the nomenclatura, out of the government, out of the Bolshevik Party. So they invented this other campaign. It's actually very ingenious. It was a campaign against rootless cosmopolitans. And so this became the first code word for attacks on Jews. And so part of what this campaign was about was this idea that you have these rootless cosmopolitans who had no allegiance to the Soviet government. They were a foreign element. They were not native to the Russian soil. They were people who spoke many languages and spent a lot of time abroad. And of course, many of these people happened to be Jewish, who grew up in the Pale of Settlement, speaking Yiddish and Ukrainian and Russian and Hebrew and German. And of course, many of them had spent time in the West because the Soviet government had sent them to the West, right?
Yes.
So the Soviet government understood that they couldn't mount just an openly anti-Semitic campaign, but as part of this, what was called socialism in one country, Stalin decided to mount this campaign against these rootless cosmopolitans. And this was really a turn back from Leninist and Trotskyist ideas of a global socialist revolution to this idea of socialism in one country. And this was really the idea of combining traditional Russian nationalism with Bolshevik policy. And so this is where we see this ideological turn against Soviet Jews. So this is really the first element of this campaign. In 1948, of course.
Let me, because I mean, this is a lot of history here, and it's amazing all the details that you are going through. So let's keep going, please.
Yeah, of course. So in 1948, of course, the State of Israel is founded. And this is a very interesting situation because at this point, Stalin has the sense that on the one hand, he's a little suspicious again of Soviet Jews. He feels like they're these rootless cosmopolitans, that they're Trotskyites. On the other hand, this is still a big element of the population. So he's having it both ways. He wants to both destroy this Yiddish-speaking Jewish culture. On the other hand, he wants to somehow maintain their loyalties. So actually, the Soviet government at the United Nations supported the founding of the State of Israel and was the second nation to do so after America. And it actually helped supply guns and military equipment to the Israeli government through Czechoslovakia. So it's this very interesting, odd time where Stalin is really trying to have it both ways. But very quickly, Stalin realizes that Israel is not going to be a socialist country like he had envisioned. He thought, many of these founders, they were these Russian-speaking Jewish socialists from the from what was now the Soviet Union. So they thought, maybe these people will be Soviet allies. He very quickly realizes that this is going to be much more of a Western-style liberal democracy. So he loses faith with them. He sees which way the tides are turning. He very quickly understands that to maintain Soviet influence in the Middle East, he needs to ally with the Arab countries. And so now this is really the beginning of official Soviet anti-Zionist policy. So again, in the Soviet Union at this point, you can't have an anti-Semitic campaign, but because again, this is 3 years after the Holocaust, the world would not have stood for it. But this is where this starts to happen, where in terms of instead of saying like a traditional Russian anti-Semite would say, the Jews have too much power, Jews are infiltrating our government, Jews are trying to work against our leaders, they start saying Zionists are infiltrating our government, Zionists are trying to murder our leaders, Zionists are a foreign element, Zionists are not true Soviets. So again, it used to be the Jews were not true Russians, now Zionists are not true Soviets. And they invent these campaigns that the Soviet Jews are part of this Zionist plot along with the CIA and the British Secret Service to murder Soviet leaders. This culminates in something called the Doctors' Plot, where you had these high-level Soviet doctors that were in the Kremlin that were treating these Soviet leaders, and the Soviet government invented this conspiracy that these Soviet doctors, most of whom were Jewish, were plotting to murder these Soviet leaders. They were called the killer doctors or the murderer doctors. And during this campaign, again, this is between 1948 and 1953, in the media, what they do is many of these Jews had changed their names to sound more Russian. What they do in the media is they expose their true Jewish names. So they put their Russian names or their Russified names next to their sort of birth Jewish names, right? And this is really the first, in some ways, example of what we see now, where this is what anti-Semites will do today on social media, on the internet, where they will put the 3 parentheses, around Jewish names to signal to anti-Semites that these are Jews, right? And that these people can't be trusted. So again, this is in the late 40s, early 50s. These Jewish doctors are on trial. The whole world is watching it. The Soviet government had already committed ethnic cleansing and mass deportations of several ethnic minorities across the Soviet Union. This included the Chechens, the Crimean Tatars, Baltic communities. And so there's a fear now in the Jewish community that the same thing is going to happen to the Soviet Jewish community under the guise of this anti-Zionist campaign. So in 1953, in March, right as this campaign is in full swing, on Purim of 1953, Stalin suffers a stroke and dies 5 days later. And so this leads to a few months where fairly quickly the new Soviet leadership, which will eventually take leadership under Khrushchev, pulls back from this anti-Zionist campaign. They release these Soviet doctors. They start to release people from the gulags, Jews that had been imprisoned as either part of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee or for being part of the Yevseksia, the Jewish section, and then very slowly these political prisoners are released from the gulags, from prisons. In 1956, you have this de-Stalinization campaign, and very slowly you move away from the worst of this Soviet anti-Semitism under the guise of anti-Zionism. But that being said, the government took an officially anti-Zionist stance, and Jews were still persecuted in the Soviet Union under the guise of being Zionist agents. So Jews that wanted to teach Hebrew in private to their friends, Jews that wanted to emigrate from the USSR were often labeled as Zionist agents in the media, on television, in the radio. And of course, the Soviet Union had a huge public press. So this press was distributed throughout the entire world through its various satellite news agencies, including in the West, including in America, England, France, Europe, and Latin America. So this is how this Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda essentially leaked into the Western media sphere. My family was caught up in this. I had one father who was in a gulag, one grandfather who was in a gulag. My great-grandfather fought in the Red Army against the Nazis, but he was eventually imprisoned by the Soviet government on charges of economic treason. And this was in the 1950s in Ukraine. And his crime was that he was a tailor, and there were never enough suits or articles of clothing in the stores. So occasionally his neighbors would come to him to ask him to sew a wedding dress or a pair of pants. And for this, he was arrested by the Soviet government, put into prison on charges of economic treason, which was a capital crime. Many Jews in the Soviet Union were also arrested for this, and some were executed. He died of a heart attack in a Soviet prison. And something like more than 90% of the people charged with this crime in Ukraine were Jews. So again, these were other ways that this anti-Semitic campaign manifested without overtly calling for the death of Jews or discrimination of Jews. Jews faced quotas in universities. Jews were forced out of, again, positions of power in the government, in academia, in science. So these are just some of the many ways that Jews faced discrimination in the USSR. Eventually, fast forward in the 1980s, you had perestroika, glasnost. Gorbachev came to power. He was a reformer. Slowly but surely, there were more reforms. Jews were allowed to leave. Very quickly, the Soviet Union disbanded in 1991. And essentially, after the fall of the Soviet Union in the post-Soviet world, there is no more official discrimination against Jews in any of these countries. Of course, Jews still face many issues, including economic hardships. Of course, there is anti-Semitism there, like in other parts of the world, but there is no official anti-Semitic policy in any of these post-Soviet countries.
So, well, first of all, this is, a very short part of the history, but you did it very well in whatever minutes we talk about this one. There's a lot of history here. There's a lot of information about how the Soviets were doing all these anti-Semitic programs, because those are programs. And what do you think about today in Russia and Ukraine? What's happening today? Because you mentioned that even though there's not an official program, there's a lot of things against Jews in Russia, especially in Russia.
Right. So, there's the political realities, and then there's, let's say, anti-Semitism both on the ground and in terms
Yes.
of government policies. So essentially, Ukraine became an independent country like all the other Soviet socialist republics with the fall of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine was really, after Russia, the largest in terms of population, but also in terms of political power and influence after Russia in the USSR, the largest country. So after the USSR fell apart, every Russian government has tried to maintain Ukraine in its sphere of influence. And it's interfered in Ukrainian domestic politics since then as a result, because since the fall of the USSR, many in Ukraine have wanted to look west towards democracy, towards liberalization, and away from the Russian sphere of influence. And so this has taken on many, many forms. a large part of the Soviet nuclear arsenal was in Ukraine. And so one of the things that happened is there was a treaty between Ukraine, Russia, America, and other Western countries where Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for its territorial sovereignty. Now, Russia has officially um, uh, invaded Ukraine and disregarded this territorial sovereignty with the invasion of Crimea about 10 years ago. This is really when the Russian invasion starts, and people forget this. So this invasion has been going on for 10 years at this point. Now, what happened is that you had this initial invasion of Crimea, Donbass, parts of eastern Ukraine, where there is a large Russian-speaking population, but there's also a lot of industrial infrastructure. So this is important for Russia, both in terms of the population, but also in terms of economic power and importance.
Correct.
Then this war really was at a standstill, a bit of a stalemate throughout the last few years of the last decade. And then in the last few years, again, Russia really relaunched this invasion, took it to a different level, was at the gates of Kiev. Basically, President Zelensky of Ukraine, who is Jewish, was minutes away from being kidnapped by Russian secret services in the very early days of that invasion. And so what you've had since then is a Russian invasion of this independent country, Ukraine. And really, it's invading it because it wants to keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence. It wants to destabilize the country so that it doesn't have a path forward to join NATO, to join the EU, and to become more closely aligned with Europe and the West more broadly. Now, of course, this has had a huge impact on Jews in Ukraine, but in the same way that it's impacted everyone else in Ukraine. So Jews have not been singled out. Jews do not face more or less hardships than anyone else in Ukraine. They face the same hardships of it's a country that's been invaded, so they're facing economic hardships, instability. Of course, in some of these places, Russian invaders that have come in and murdered civilians, raped them in many cases, as we know, much as Hamas did on October 7th when they invaded Israel. And so this continues. But again, I want to emphasize that the Jewish community is not at any more of a risk than any other members of the Ukrainian community.
Yes.
Meanwhile, in Russia, what's happened is since Putin has come to power, you've had this slow eating away at political and civic liberty in Russia. So bit by bit, you have less freedom of the press, you have less freedom to gather, less freedom of expression. And so again, Jewish citizens in Russia, who are Russian citizens, the same way as other members of the Russian government, they face these problems as Russian citizens, not as Jewish citizens. So they do not face any more or any less political problems than other members of Russian society. But that being said, anti-Semitism does continue to be a problem in Russia. I would say in Ukraine as well, to a lesser extent. I mean, this idea, of course, that Ukraine is run by Nazis is a total Russian misinformation campaign. Vladimir Putin was a lifelong KGB officer, and this is exactly what the Soviet Union did. When he was a KGB officer in East Germany during the Cold War, what he would do is that he would actually take neo-Nazis in East Germany, train them as Soviet agents, and release them in West Germany to show that West Germany had a Nazi problem, right? So this is something that Putin and this government, they know how to do. This is something they've been doing for a long time. This is basically accusing the other side of being Nazis. This is a classic move. Again, there are more neo-Nazis in Russia than probably any other country in Europe. But again, I want to reiterate, not at the government level, not at the level of policy, right? So Jewish citizens of Russia do not face any hardships specifically as Jewish citizens. But that being said, there's also a flip side to this, which is interesting, which is that now after the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukrainian and Russian Jews have a place to go. They can go to Israel. They're welcome with open arms. So in some ways, this is obviously a much better situation than during the Soviet period when they weren't allowed to emigrate. So when things get badly enough, when things get bad enough, they do have a place to go. They have this Jewish sovereign state where Jews from Ukraine and Russia can go and be welcomed as citizens. So, yeah, in general terms, that's the overview of the situation for the Jewish community in Ukraine and Russia now.
Wow. And is there a lot of Jewish people immigrating to any place around the world, to Israel or to other places?
Yeah, I mean, I know in the early months of this latest Russian invasion, I mean, there were tens of thousands of Jewish citizens from Ukraine and Russia. I don't have numbers in front of me now. I know that those numbers have increased. Again, to some extent, even though the war continues, it's come to a bit of a stalemate. So I believe those numbers have decreased a little bit just in terms of monthly numbers, but I know that that continues. So this does, they do continue to go to Israel. Of course, they continue to come to America. They go to Poland, they go to Germany, they go to other countries as well, some to Latin America also. But Israel, of course, does continue to be a primary destination for these refugees.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this this part of the Jewish history in the Soviet Union, as well as in Russia and Ukraine. Let me go and now move to San Francisco and what you are doing with the Hindu people there. There's a lot of new things that are coming, and yeah, I would like to move to over that. And I know that you will go to a rally, and let's talk about the relationship, not of the rally. Let's talk about the relationship between the Hindu community and the Jewish community.
So the Hindu community really since October 7th, but even before, the Hindu community has been incredible allies to the Jewish community here. They have been showing up to our rallies. They've been having their own rallies and their own programs, showing support for Israel, standing up against Hamas and against their sympathizers here in the Bay Area. They've been amazing partners. One of the main organizations is the Hindu American Foundation, who has been, this is one of the Hindu community organizations. They've been incredible partners for AJC, for Stand With Us, which is another great Jewish organization here. And so they've just been amazing. They come to city council meetings where you have these anti-Israel resolutions that are up for debate. And just on a personal level, really just so supportive. Part of this also is that again, Hindus and members of the more Indian community more broadly have experienced a lot of Islamist terrorism in India. So they are also familiar with this kind of terrorism that Israel is facing and that the global Jewish community is facing. Of course, in Latin America and Argentina, and you just recently marked the anniversary of the Amia bombing, which was carried out by the Iranian government and its agents. And this is the largest single-day massacre of Jews outside of Israel since World War II. And so this was carried out by Iran, who, of course, funds Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, who are now fighting Israel. And so, again, this is a global crisis. Our Hindu friends and partners understand this. They understand the threat of Islamism and this is extreme Islamist ideology around the world. And I'm happy to say that this Saturday, I will be speaking at a rally put on by the Hindu American Foundation, along with other Jewish and ethnic community groups, to mark, commemorate an attack against Hindu pilgrims in Riesi, India last month, where these Hindu pilgrims were attacked by Islamic terrorists. And so I'm happy to stand with the Hindu community to join them in support, that we have to really show the world that, we need to fight this together. This is a threat to our values of liberalism, of tolerance, of inclusion, that if we want to have a tolerant, inclusive community, we can't allow for Islamic extremism and other forms of terrorism into our communities. We can't let it be normalized. and we all have to fight together against it. And so this is really where the Hindu community and the Jewish community has stood arm in arm in this fight here, and really elsewhere all over the world.
Well, thank you very much for this insight also as well. And time is flying, and we went over 30 minutes, but this was really interesting because for I would say for the entire world to know details about what Soviet Union was doing against the Jews, it's very important. You went into very little details, and which will allow us to know more about our heritage, and this is very important. And also as well, this Hindu and Jewish connection, which is also very important because we are facing the same threats, and these people in India, they know what we are talking about, and we are, it's not fighting, but we are conducting a way to face this problem to the world. Oleg, it has been a pleasure to have a teacher, a professor like you, because this was an amazing class about the Soviet Union and our relationship with the Jews. Thank you very much. And for all the people that was watching this show, we are inviting you to another show, to another great show, because we are having great shows with different people around the world, and it's very important that we are showing that there's hope, that we do have a past where we had also had problems, but we are facing a good future, and we have hope for the new generation. Thank you very much, Oleg. Enjoy San Francisco, which is very nice, and see you together in another Cafe with Kevin. Thank you very much, and take care now.
Thank you.